In this second session, we're going to go deeper into the four Gospels. But first, let's ask that question. Why four Gospels? And why these four creatures here? The man for Matthew, the ox for Luke, the eagle for John, and the lion for Mark. As we said in the last session, these relate to the picture of God and God's power and mystery in both Ezekiel chapter 1 and Revelation chapter 4. But there's a little bit more than that. They have been used mostly in early medieval iconography and the writing of texts like the Book of Kells to demonstrate something about the gospel itself. The clearest example, you might say they are four pictures of Christ. The clearest example of that picture of Christ is Luke and the idea of an ox and Jesus as a burden bearer, one who carries a load, one who is gentle and lowly and compassionate because he is part of this burden-bearing context. Okay, so that's the picture of Luke. They're simplified versions. What about the eagle? And the eagle is the picture of Christ that John paints, and it's one of high-flying, something that is supernaturally different from anyone else. And so John emphasizes the almost detachment of the Christ. Still the same, but just very different as well. What about the lion? The lion, as a symbol of Mark, shows Jesus as a courageous fighter. Mark's word is immediately he did this. And it's like he's a lion coming against the enemy, against demons and against the forces of disease and the demonic. And so it's like a much more aggressive picture of Christ. And then in Matthew, the man, or sometimes the teacher, and Jesus as the rabbi. And you think of the Sermon on the Mount and that you have heard it said, but I say to you, and a picture of somebody much more intellectual, much more the new Moses. So we have four separate pictures of Jesus. They're all true. They're all accurate. They're all interesting. They're all helpful. But by themselves, they are not quite adequate. But together, the Gospels provide a complete picture of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's where we're going with this idea. Now, how did the Gospels come to be written? And I'm just going to quote here from the beginning part of Luke's Gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So that's how Luke begins his gospel. It's really interesting, isn't it? We're tempted to glide over it because it's a sort of a, yeah, let's get on with the story. But he says something really important. He's setting his stall out as a historian. He says that many have undertaken to compile an account. That's interesting, isn't it? How many is many? That means more than Mark, Luke, and John. You could almost be clear that at least John's gospel wasn't written when he wrote this. And we might presume that he didn't know the existence of Matthew. That's an arguable case. I think it's pretty clear that he knew about Mark's gospel. So who are these many who have undertaken to compile an account? And then he says something else. He says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. Now, that's very important for Luke because Luke was not an eyewitness. He was definitely a second generation believer. He was the companion of Paul on his journeys, and he had access to Peter and maybe the other disciples as well. So that's interesting, isn't it? So he knows eyewitnesses. He knows eyewitnesses, but he's not an eyewitness himself. So he talks about people compiling an account, people who were eyewitnesses. And then he has this phrase, and servants of the word. And it's said, that phrase has an and in front of it. It's an additional group of people, servants of, and it can only really mean preachers, early preachers. So he's got a hold of his information from people who've written things down or compiled an account, from eyewitnesses and from preachers. So this is like his bibliography. He's talking about how he constructed his careful account. He said, well, it seemed after reading all this stuff, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully, to write it out for you in consecutive order, bit by bit. That's the idea. And he dedicates the work to most excellent Theophilus. We don't quite know what that means. We'll get into that a little bit later, but the word does mean lover of God. Philos means lover, Theo means God. So it could mean a particular person called Theophilus, or it could mean a type of person. It could mean, oh, lover of God, wherever you are. People who love God, listen to the good news, that sort of thing. And that's corroborated, I should say, by the next bit where it says, so that you might know the exact truth. So Theophilus, lover of God, so that you might know with certainty the things that you've been taught, so that I can underscore what you've only heard from a few sketchy words from preachers, from people writing odd bits down, people who are eyewitnesses. I brought it all together so that you might know the exact truth. Okay, now more generally, nearly everything we know about the life and ministry of Jesus comes from the Bible's 4 gospel books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The gospels existed in oral tradition, people just telling stories, in the young Christian communities for some time before they were set down in written form. And as the eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus' life began to pass away in the latter part of the first century, it probably became more urgent that these events be preserved in writing. I mean, the feel of the Gospels is that any minute now, Jesus might return. So there might not have been an urgency to write things down. But then as people died off, as time went on, no, we need to get this sorted out. We need to write this down now. So look through this passage from Luke carefully and consider the points of that process. Let's move on. One little question here. Why did they write in Greek? The Bible's New Testament, which includes these 4 Gospels, was written entirely in Greek because it was the common language of the Mediterranean lands in Roman times. The first of the Gospels was probably Mark, probably written between 40 and 60 AD. I'm saying probably, and no one can say certainly. And Mark was working from the recollections of Peter. In one interesting phrase in an ancient historian's account, it says that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. That could mean secretary, it could mean translator. Okay, and Matthew and Luke were probably written between 50 and 70 AD, maybe a touch later. And traditionally, the Gospel of John is believed to have appeared in its final form around 90 AD, though containing new and accurate details from the earliest memories of Jesus. It's just a different kind of gospel, and we'll get to that later in the Gospel of John. All right. The Synod of Carthage will probably be a new concept. Just think of it as a church council. And this was right at the end of the 300s, 397 AD. Now, all four Gospels are anonymous in the sense that none includes the author's name. Those traditional names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, did not become associated with those writings until the 2nd century. In the early centuries of Christianity, our four Gospels coexisted with a number of other writings, many of which have not been preserved. We just have little mentions of them here and then. We know they were there. Some of them are still extant. We know quite a lot about them. So they call the church council the Synod of Carthage right there in 397, and they adopted the 27 books of the New Testament. They were formulating the canon. This canon means yardstick. This is the rule. This is what we believe in the church. And they included the four Gospels as the canon of the New Testament. So that's the tradition of the church, seeking the Lord. They were devout people. They were making a division between things that were authentic and things that were non-authentic, things that were the earliest. Is this work ancient or is it modern? Is it tainted with a different philosophy or heresy, or does it derive back to the original eyewitnesses, the original compilers, the original preachers? Is it apostolic? And that were the points of the criteria that they used to make their judgments. Okay, so they made that judgment, and our canon was more or less set in 397 AD. And I've got the phrase here at the top of the page: 4 windows into one reality. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they are strikingly similar. Syn means together, optic means sight or looking. We're looking at this together. We have a similar perspective. Bible scholars believe that the authors of Matthew and Luke were aware of the Gospel of Mark, and they incorporated much of it into their own writings, along with material from another common source that's not been preserved, plus unique material of their own. Whenever you write a book, you use other authors, a non-fiction book. Whenever you compile something together, and sometimes that's a complex activity, and this is not strange or weird to think that somebody like Matthew has contacts and people that he knows himself, and he also has the Gospel of Mark in front of him, written down. And I say that because a lot of it is word for word the same as you get it from Mark into Matthew and into Luke. It's exactly the same. And then there's some little tilts of differences. So you have to think about why has he quoted this bit and not that bit? Okay, so that's why I use the phrase 4 windows into one reality. Sometimes what we're looking at is Matthew's perspective or Luke's perspective, and then further back we're looking at Mark's perspective. All of us come to think about things according to where we are and who we are and the story of our own lives, don't we? We have preferences and perspective. We have a way of looking at reality. Okay, now, so that covers Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're very, very similar. The Gospel of John is very different from the Synoptic Gospels in the way it presents and interprets the events of Jesus' earthly life. The Synoptics portray Jesus traveling about and preaching in parables about the coming kingdom of God. John presents a more spiritual and meditative view of Jesus. Both John and the Synoptics present many of the same events of Jesus' life, specifically his trial, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. The resurrection makes for a very interesting study because you can see 4 accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. They're all different. They even contain slightly different bits of information. They're not really contradictory. They're much more complementary. They fit together, but they do contain different bits of information. And so that's worth considering when you think about the Gospels all together and you ask the question, why 4 Gospels? And this is an answer. They are 4 windows into one reality. And because of the differences among the Gospels, you're tempted to ask, which is the real one? Which is the correct portrayal of the events of Jesus' life? However, each of the 4 is a unique picture of Jesus drawn from different eyewitnesses and different traditions. And we're fortunate to have 4 views of these central events of Christianity. We'll stop there, and I'd like you to just think about this before the next session. Just continue to ask and reflect on the question, why are there 4 views of the same thing? Okay, well done. See you in the next session.